Ms Graham.
Thank you. Constable Walker, I omitted to ask you one question earlier today, and I just want to ask if you want to comment on this. There may be evidence available to the chair in due course, we've not heard this yet, but it may become available, to suggest that Sheku Bayo did not stomp on PC Short on her lower back. You've given a description of what you saw.
Yeah.
Do you wish to comment on that evidence?
No, that was my recollection.
Thank
I'm
you.
happy with that.
Thank you. Right, I'd like to move back to where we were just before we broke for lunch. I was going to come on to the question of statements and status.
Yep.
And when I talk about status, I mean your status as either a witness or as a suspect having to contemplate possible criminal charges.
Yep.
And could I look at paragraph 94, please, of your inquiry statement? And you say, whilst at Kirkcaldy Police Office, I was not formally given my status. I was aware that some supervisory officers came by the canteen and offered support and stated that we had nothing to worry about in relation to the incident, that we were not detained as suspects and would be treated as witnesses. I took this to be merely words of encouragement and support, not a formal briefing or declaration. I have no recollection of ever being spoken to by the PERC or briefed by the PERC at any point. I have no recollection of receiving any advice regarding my status. So, looking at that paragraph, can I ask you, what did you mean when you said you were not formally given your status?
I mean, I think at that point, in relation to the whole being in the canteen, we knew at that point that it would become a PERC investigation because of a death in custody. And if I'm being honest, I was actually waiting on or expecting, I had an anticipation of the PERC arriving in the canteen to formally take over. This is what happened. This is the SOP that we're going to be working through. This is what This is what the next steps are going to be. And as I say, that never seemed to happen that day.
So you would have, when you say formally, you would have expected the PERC or someone from the PERC to come in and speak to the officers in the canteen?
Yeah, as a form of an official briefing that we're taking over the investigation and this is what's going to happen.
But that didn't happen that
No.
day. And then paragraph 102, if we can have a look at that on your statement. I was never requested to complete a statement by anyone. Now, we've discussed conversations that you've had with Conrad Trickett and such like. And I think when I looked at your statement previously, there was a suggestion that you were thinking something would be done before 4 o'clock. And your equipment, you were told your equipment was seized. But were you ever asked to give operational statements during that day by any of the senior officers, such as Conrad Trickett?
No, not that I can recall.
And was any correspondence or anything along those lines of requests for statements from PERC ever shared with you by anyone?
No. As in like written or correspondence?
Yeah, any email correspondence
No,
sent
nothing
to you
like
or
that. No,
anything along
no.
those lines?
We were in the canteen area, doesn't have computers, so we didn't have access to email and nothing was passed to us, like printed out either.
Right. And are you aware of any request with involving PERC and the MIT Major Incident Team on the 7th or 8th of May that year regarding giving a statement? I understand you were asked to go and see a D.I. Wilson at some point?
I don't know I can't recall the name, but we were asked to go and speak to the MIT team, and we were asked by them if we wished to provide a statement. But we were under the impression that that was not the PERC inquiry. That was not the PERC that was requesting a statement. We were basically advised that that was the MIT team were running a parallel investigation or something along these lines, but it was not made clear that it was a PERC request at that point.
So that's not something you were aware of?
No.
And when you say we, who do you mean we? Who are you referring to?
Myself and the other officers.
Right. Were all of the other officers who'd attended Hayfield Road called together to that meeting?
It wasn't even called to a meeting. We came in for a discussion of trim, and they basically said that the MIT teams upstairs want to have a word with you. It's a tick box exercise, and you don't need to provide a statement.
Who told you that?
Inspector Alan Seath.
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Inspector Alan Seath.
Seath, thank you. And you've mentioned TRIM a couple of times, and I realise I've not actually asked you to explain that acronym. Do you mind telling us
I
what
can't
that
mind
is?
exactly what it stands for, but it's basically after a traumatic incident, it's a debriefing, a form of counselling session through trained officers who just basically establish if you're maybe needing a wee bit further help to deal with the incident that you've just been dealing with.
Thank you. So, but in relation to this discussion with the MIT, Seath had told you didn't have to provide a statement, and so you declined to provide a statement.
Yes, because that was my understanding at the time, was we were to go and we were to decline it, and then because we would hear, and the PERC would note the statement in due course.
Thank you. Can I ask you to look at paragraph 96 of your statement, and this relates to notebooks. And you were asked about your understanding of obligations in completing paperwork, including my notebook, a use of force form, a use of spray form, insofar as they related to the events at Hayfield Road. My understanding is that in relation to the use of force or CS spray form, these are to be completed prior to terminating duty by officers, or if unable, by the supervising officers. In relation to my notebook, my understanding is that this is at the discretion of the officer. And can I just go through that paragraph? The use of force and the CS spray forms, they're two separate forms, are they?
I think they might have been combined now, but I'm not 100% sure. They were changing quite regularly at that point and being amended.
Do you remember what the position was in 2015?
They were on the computer system, but I can't remember which form was what, if they were combined or not.
So you had access to them on the computer system?
Yes, we would have to go into the computers and search
That's
them.
how you would access them, I should say. And they are completed prior to terminating duty by officers? Use of force or use of spray forms?
Yes.
You didn't do that on that day, though, did you, before you left?
No.
No. And then if you say if you're unable, by the supervising officers. Now, who would your supervising officer be?
On that day, I couldn't
that
tell
day.
you. I couldn't tell you.
Right.
I mean, it's like I said, on that day, we were waiting on somebody coming in to take the lead as to what we're doing and what was happening and what was expected of us. So in relation to filling in forms and all the rest of it, that was just something that we weren't considering. Everybody on the teams was quite...
Can you explain, we've heard about senior officers, we've heard about different ranks. What's the difference between that and a supervising officer?
Not sure, to be honest. I think just somebody that's of senior rank could be a supervising officer.
It's just it's words you use, and I'm just this is your statement. I'm just wondering what were you meaning by that description?
Like if we couldn't do it, then the sergeant could do it. If the sergeant couldn't do it, the inspector could do it. So anybody that's in the chain of command.
So it's more senior officers to you?
Yeah.
And that would be Acting Police Sergeant Maxwell?
He was in the canteen beside us, so he wouldn't be in a position to do that.
So he wouldn't be one of those supervising officers at the time?
Again, I don't know. I don't know what the process was in the canteen. That was.
Okay.
We were all kind of struggling with that.
All right. in relation to the notebook, you've said your understanding was that it was at the discretion of the officer. What do you mean by that?
Just in general, notebooks are for keeping the officer's notes. If you need to write something down, you write it down. It's best practice to write it down, and you should write stuff down, but it's not a must for want of a...
So, in your view, there's no obligation on you to complete that?
It's good practice because you may need to rely on your notebook in the future.
Right. We see, people will have seen officers or maybe even on TV shows turning up and being asked to explain, and they pull their notebook out.
Yeah, I refer to my notebook for notes I've made at the time.
Were you ever advised by anyone to complete your notebook?
No.
In the canteen?
No, I was never told to do so.
Now, in paragraph 100 of your statement, you say, if we can have that on the screen, please. You say that you recall you were asked by PC Tomlinson if he should complete his notebook. I advised him that I would not be completing my notebook until advised that we should. I was not aware of the processes following a serious injury, death in custody as to what should be completed and by whom. So you weren't aware of the processes that should be followed at that stage?
Yeah, no idea.
And do you think that you were influential in relation to PC Tomlinson by giving him that?
I didn't give him advice as to what he should do, but I advised that I wouldn't be filling mine in until somebody gave us some sort of guidance on it.
So you simply told him you wouldn't be completing his notebook, but you didn't advise him not to complete his?
No, I just told him what I would be doing.
Right. In terms of the difference in level of experience, you've told us that you had 10 years service at that time. What stage was PC Tomlinson at?
He was younger in service, but I couldn't give you an exact number.
Can I just be clear? I understood you said you had a total of 17 years, or is that now?
That's now.
That's now, thank you.
Thank you. Can we look at your PERC statement, please, 264 now? And could we look at page 11, please? And paragraph 5. And this starts, I returned to the canteen, and about half an hour later I went home. While I was in the canteen with my team, the advice from Amanda given was to say nothing to anyone at that time. That was my intention anyway until we found out more about what kind of inquiry was going to take place and what the man had died of. I also made it known that I would not be completing my notebook either, and I suggested that others don't do theirs. Some of the team, I'm not sure who, spoke about doing their notebooks, but I wasn't doing that. No other officers out with the team gave any instructions on their notebooks. So you've said in this statement, I suggested that others don't do theirs. Do you see that now? This is your statement that was given to PERC on the 4th of June 2015. Should we prefer this version? Because it was closer to the time.
Yes, but I think the suggestion was that I wasn't advising him not to do his. It was a case of wait and see what is going to be asked of you as to what the next step is. So if you have to fill it in, you have to fill it in. Then it was no, don't fill it in. Again, if you're asked to fill it in, do it. But wait and see what's asked to us first, or what the process is.
And then can I ask you about Amanda Given? You say the advice from Amanda Given was to say nothing to anyone at that time. Do you remember what she said in the canteen?
No.
Do you remember if she said anything about your status? or seeking confirmation of your status?
No, she was waiting in the canteen with us. I think she was in the same sort of situation as the rest of us, which she was waiting on to find out what was going to be happening next. It was just turned into a waiting area.
Okay, thank you. Can we look at an SOP on the notebooks, please? PS 10937. I've got a note here, page 4. And let me just, could we move up the page slightly? Here it is, 3.4. Entries in notebooks and PDAs should be made at the time or as soon as possible thereafter. The date and time of every entry must be recorded in the margin of a notebook. On no account should you make notes elsewhere and later copy them into your notebook. So this is the notebooks SOP, Standard Operating Procedure, and it seems to say entries should be made at the time or as soon as possible thereafter. Were you aware of this SOP?
Yes.
It doesn't seem to indicate in there that it's a matter for discretion that notebooks are completed. It seems to be recommending that the entries are made as soon as possible.
Yes, any entries that you're going to make should be made as soon as possible.
Okay. Can I ask you now to look at the investigation of deaths SOP, PS 11110. And this is page 6. Sorry, I think we might have passed it. Here it is. And if we could go down, please. Keep going. Right, it's 4.7. The role of the initial attending officers is critical in all suspicious deaths. And it indicates that the information and circumstances which officers will be presented with at the outset of the inquiry are essential for allowing early decisions to be made. And then 4.8, it is therefore of critical importance that the initial officers in attendance record all relevant details in their official police notebooks or PDAs and ensure that such information is passed to the appointed SIO without delay. And were you aware of that part of the SOP?
Yeah, but it doesn't apply because we're not the initial attending officers at a suspicious death.
Right, okay. So you didn't think that applied?
No.
Can I ask who the SIO was in any event?
In
relation to yours on the 3rd of May?
No idea.
You don't know. Can I ask you about the use of force and the use of spray forms? I understand from your statement that you need access to a computer to be able to complete those. Is that correct?
Yes.
And were there any computers in the canteen?
No.
Can I ask you about paragraph 97 of your statement, please? It's at the bottom. Did you want to complete these forms that day? If you'd had access to the computer, would you have wanted to complete those forms?
I would have waited on somebody, let's say, taking the lead. We were in a state of shock at what had happened, and we genuinely were just waiting on somebody coming in to take the lead, for want of a better term, to hold us by the hand and take us through the process. We had no idea what was going on, what was required, what we had to do.
So looking at paragraph 97, you talk about the use of spray forms. At no time were any of us afforded access to a computer. Additionally, I was unsure and remain unsure as to whether I was legally required to complete these forms in the case of a death in police custody, particularly in respect of receiving legal advice on whether to document any aspect of the events. So again, is this an example of one of the areas of uncertainty and lack of a surety that you had on the day?
Yes, aye.
Yeah. And can I ask you to look at PERC 01344, please? This is a memorandum. A memorandum regarding operational discharge of CS incapacitant spray. Now, I know you had your PAVA spray.
Yes.
And it's dated the 1st of April 2013 from the Assistant Chief Constable, Local Policing West, to Divisional Commanders, Heads of Department. Do you see that?
Yes.
Have you seen this before?
The memo.
Yes.
I can't recall reading that specific memo, but we get a lot of them.
Right. So I'm going to go through this if that's okay. So you see that from the 1st of April 2013, there's a legal requirement for the Police Service of Scotland, the SPA and the PERC to ensure compliance with the provisions, and it gives certain statutory provisions in the Human Rights Convention. This means that on every occasion where CS incapacitant spray is discharged operationally, there is a legal requirement to record the incident and report onwards to PERC within 24 hours. And then there's mention of a particular form that's been prepared and is available on the intranet for that purposes. And then it says, when complete, the form should be emailed to, and we've redacted out some details, marked for the attention of Officer Safety Training, Local Policing West, who will be responsible for its onward transmission to the Police Investigations and Review Commissioner. And the completion of this form is separate to the existing use of force form that's on the system as well, which must still be submitted. So would it appear that at least in April 2013 there's two forms?
That would suggest so at that point, yes.
So there's the use of force form and then a separate use of for spray,
Yeah.
use of CS spray. So were you aware of this change in the legislation that required these forms to be completed?
I was aware that the forms had to be completed. I wasn't sure what the legal
Right.
mechanism behind it, but I was aware that the forms need to be completed.
Thank you. Can I ask you to look at PS 10933, the use of force SOP, please? And I'm going to look at paragraph 6.2. And it should start, use of force is defined as use of the baton to strike an individual or individuals, or the operational discharge of CS incapacitant spray. So the use of force would be triggered where a baton is used or a spray is sprayed.
Yes.
Those are both are considered to be use of force by an officer. And then can we look at 6.4? Additionally, on every occasion where CS incapacitant spray is discharged operationally, there's a legal requirement to record the incident and report it to the PERC within 24 hours. And then moving on to 6.5, it incorporates reference to the form and says forms must be submitted as soon as reasonably practical after the incident, but no later than the end of the discharging officer's tour of duty. And if the officer is unavailable, then a supervisor must arrange its completion. So again, were you aware of the contents of this SOP?
Again, I think that's referring back to the same form, so it's just a case of that the forms would need to be completed.
Okay. Can I ask you about any other discussions that you had with Amanda Given? So I'll refer your paragraph 82 in your statement mentions this. And it says, we were joined by Police Federation representative Amanda Given at some time that morning, and later by Chief Inspector Conrad Trickett. Several other supervising officers passed through and spoke with us at points throughout the day, but did not remain. When Amanda Given was with you that morning in the canteen, did she give you any advice about completing forms or completing paperwork?
No.
Right. Now, I know you were up to date with all your training in May of 2015, is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. I would like to ask you some questions about race. You've answered, there's about 7 paragraphs in here where your comment on race, and where you were asked specific questions about whether you'd taken it into account or not. Can you tell us what training you've received on race, in equality and diversity?
Equality and diversity was the first week or two when I went to the police college was dedicated solely to diversity training, and then I think there's ongoing modules, but the majority of it was at the police college.
And the ongoing modules, are they refresher training that you continue to get?
Yes, I mean occasionally you get sort of memos coming out when it's coming up to religious festivals and things like that to be like extra activity around about mosques and that at certain times of the year. Yeah, you do get supplied just sort of reminders and refreshers.
And then in February 2014, so that's the year prior to this, I think your training log records indicate you received an equality and diversity values and ethics briefing. Was that correct?
Can't recall.
Right. But you were getting up to date equality and diversity training at that time. And of the training that you'd had, what sort of topics did that cover? Do you recall?
Like I say, a lot of it. I can't recall the exact bits. It's just being aware of other people's cultures and religions and like needs that might be required and sudden deaths that we're dealing with. Again, religious and cultural beliefs in relation to postmortems and just to be sensitive. When dealing with things like that, just to take into consideration that there might be religious and cultural needs.
And did that include dealing with members of the black community?
Yes.
And tell us, if you were to respond to a call tomorrow, for example, that a black man was in possession of a knife, thinking about the racial awareness training that you've had, would you do anything differently tomorrow than you did in 2015?
No.
Do you ever take someone's physical characteristics or skin colour or religion and make assumptions about them? Categorise them that they'll be a particular type of person? Do you ever make assumptions, for example, that a black person is maybe more likely to be a terrorist?
No.
What, on the training you've had, what did you learn, if anything, about unconscious bias?
It's basically along the lines of like that example that you're given, assuming that somebody who's black is a terrorist, but without actively thinking it, but just being almost instinctively and reacting to them that way. Mm-hmm. If I suppose the example would be immediately becoming fearful of a group of black teenagers that are standing as a group and then walking away from them on the other side of the road without actually making that conscious decision, would be my understanding. Mm. It's something that you do subconsciously without actually.
And in the training, were you able to identify any areas of unconscious bias in your own beliefs and perceptions?
No.
Were you ever asked to do that as part of the training that you've received?
No. I mean, obviously, as part of the training, it is to make you look at your own actions and to evaluate your own actions, yes, but...
You don't recall ever being asked to think about your own unconscious biases? Or to identify any that you may have?
No.
So of the learning points from the training that you've had about bias, how have you implemented those or incorporated those into your everyday work as a police officer?
As I say, the main ones for me is the cultural awareness when you're coming to deal with things like sudden deaths, and you know that there's I mean that's the one that jumps to mind. Is the need for like post-mortems and stuff, where the fiscal's going to get involved. There could be post-mortems, and that might be against cultural beliefs, and the fact that some religions require the body to be buried within 24 hours or 48 hours, and that's just sensitivities that you need to be aware of. And then obviously for the custody training side of it, the fact that some religions obviously require hands to be washed before eating food, and that so it's somebody, if you're going to give somebody food, then you've got to give them the opportunity to wash their hands first, and that's that sort of religious belief. It's not just a case of, assuming that somebody's just been in awkward custody because they're wanting it to do this, they're wanting it to do that. There's actually a legitimate reason behind it.
And as well as those, how did they inform your practice as an officer on a day-to-day basis? Presumably not every day you're dealing with post-mortems or that type of thing. So were there things that you changed about your day-to-day work in light of the training that you've received?
I wouldn't say that I've needed to change my way, because I've always tried to deal with people fairly and honestly and equally.
Okay. Have you ever come across any examples of racial discrimination at Kirkcaldy Police Office?
No.
Have you ever come across any racist jokes or comments?
No.
If you did come across anything like that, how would you respond?
Challenge them. That's not acceptable.
And is that the way that senior officers would respond?
I don't know. You need to. That's something you need to take up with them.
And when you say challenge them, what do you mean by that?
Just tell them that sort of behaviour is not acceptable.
Have you ever seen your colleagues exhibit that type of behaviour, to make racist comments or racist jokes?
No.
At the time of Mr. Biles' death, so May 2015, what awareness did you have at that time about public concerns about the use of force by police officers, particularly against black men?
A lot of it was getting reported in the news from America, that the Black Lives Matters campaign was really forming, and that there was a lot of news coverage of deaths of black males at the hands of the police.
And was that something that you were aware of?
Yes.
You keep up to date with the news? Yeah. And from your own experience, to what extent was that an issue of concern for the officers in Police Scotland, and in particular in Kirkcaldy?
No.
Was there any discussions about that?
No.
Or sharing of information? No. Are you aware of other high-profile cases in the UK, so wider than Scotland, down south, for example, in which a person has died in police custody where, well, there's been restraint and/or there's issues of a person being restrained face down that had given rise to sort of public discussion and public concern?
At that time, no.
No, not in 2015.
No.
You'll be aware of that now, presumably, are you?
Yes.
Is there, from your own experience, Constable, is there much information sharing amongst police forces? I'm thinking about maybe information that they have down south in relation to restraint and concerns in that regard, is there much information sharing with the police force up here, such as yourself? Do you get information that's come from England?
I mean, that would go back into a higher up level and then would be disseminated down, so I don't know how can you speak into the intelligence sharing.
So that would be more senior officers,
Yeah.
or maybe the officer safety training department?
Yes, aye.
So at the time of Mr. Bio's death, what measures, if any, were actually in place that would allow someone in your position as a constable in Kirkcaldy Police Office to receive information about restraints or learning lessons that had arisen out of high-profile cases down in England?
In relation to OST, that would be your yearly refresher. Or if there was... No, I mean, that would be the main one, OST refresher training courses.
And at those OST yearly refresher courses, do they have an opportunity to discuss lessons that have been learned from other cases down in England, for example?
I don't think we actually discussed it. It was just that they would amend the techniques and that are used, and then they would teach us the new techniques and or make us aware of if you're doing this technique, be mindful of this. But they wouldn't certainly give case studies or anything like that.
So you're not receiving sort of case studies for discussion at those yearly refreshers?
No, not that I'm aware of.
All right. Thinking now, how confident are you now that in the training you've received in relation to race-related issues and deaths in custody, that is providing you with the information that you need to allow you to do your job in Kirkcaldy?
I've been able to continue doing my job for the last 7 years since the incident without issue, so yeah, I'm fairly confident.
Okay, thank you. What's your own understanding and awareness of the black community in Kirkcaldy? Do you have an awareness of a black community in Kirkcaldy?
I mean, I've not worked in Kirkcaldy now for a few years, so...
At the time, in 2015, what was your awareness then?
I don't know. I didn't really have one. Like I say, you deal with calls on a call-by-call basis, so...
Yeah. Had you at that time in 2015 been involved in any community relation work with the black community in Kirkcaldy? No. Were you aware of other officers in Kirkcaldy engaging with work with the black community?
That would, if there was, that would be down to sort of community teams who would be engaging with them as opposed to response teams.
Your team was a response team?
A response team, yes.
So the officers at Hayfield Road were a response team, not a community team?
Yes.
Was that all the officers, or were there any involved who were part of a community team?
The officers that were there today, that day, were all response, or CID plainclothes.
Thank you. So what's your experience, or what was your experience in 2015 of interacting with black men or black members of the community in Kirkcaldy in the course of discharging your police duties? Either as suspects or as victims or other people that you need to speak to, witnesses?
Just as a response officer out noting statements and that from them, that was just normal day-to-day interactions.
How much contact had you had with the black community in 2015?
I can't give exact numbers.
Not exact numbers, but could you give us an impression?
No.
Are you aware, or were you aware in 2015 of any tensions between the black community and the police?
No.
Were you aware of any negative views held by colleagues of yours in Kirkcaldy Police Office in relation to black people generally?
No.
Did you have any concerns at that time about the policing of black communities in relation to use of force
No.
in Kirkcaldy? What sort of stereotypes are you aware of about black people generally, or black men specifically in the context of criminal justice? Are you aware of any sort of stereotypes that exist?
No.
No. Are you aware that black men may be perceived as more likely to resist or not be compliant, or more likely to be violent?
No.
No.
Not from my experience.
Are you aware that they may be perceived as having superhuman strength or size?
No.
Do you have any assumptions along those lines?
No. None.
Looking back now to 2015, do you think you assumed that Shekubayo posed a greater risk because he was particularly strong, or going to be more violent because he was black?
No. It was just that he was physically quite broad. That's been reflected by the CCTV footage. I don't think anybody would argue with the fact that he looked quite a strong individual. And that's, like I say, the only thing that we took into consideration was his possible physical power.
If he'd been white, would you have seen him as being less of a threat?
No, because he still would have been the same physical size.
We've heard that later that day, an officer described him as like the size of a house. Is that the type of view that you held?
That's not how I would have described him, but I'd certainly say he was broad built, broad about the shoulders.
Of course, at that time, you and PC Payton are 6'4",
Mm-hmm.
and he was 5'10", so he was actually shorter than both of you.
Yeah.
And we talked about weights
Mhm.
yesterday. I won't go back over that. When you arrived at the scene, did you have any expectations before you arrived about what you were going to find based on what you'd heard over the airwaves transmissions?
No, I think we covered that yesterday. We came up with possible scenarios, but ultimately you just got to wait until you get there and see what you're presented with.
Thank you. I think I've dealt with these other questions yesterday. Looking back now, what role, if any, do you think that Mr. Bayo's race may have played in the assumptions you made about his behaviour and the choices you made as to the best course of action that day?
I didn't make any assumptions about his behaviour. Everything was intelligence-led on what we've seen when we arrived.
And what about the choices you made? Looking back now, do you think his race played any basis in that?
No, the decisions were all based on the threat that was posed to ourselves and the members of the public.
Thank you. Could you give me one moment, please? That completes my questioning. Thank you.
Thank you. Constable Walker, I wonder if you could help me with one or two matters. You said yesterday that when the reports about the events in Hayfield Road were coming in, that Sergeant Maxwell was in command.
Yes.
And could we perhaps just look at the entry in the spreadsheet, if you've got it, on page 2. We looked at this yesterday, but I just want to revisit it for a moment. At 07:17:23, Acting Police Sergeant Scott Maxwell made contact with control, and he said, "I want all units to attend that, bearing in mind officer safety. Now, I think you said yesterday that as a result of that command that all units should attend, you would expect perhaps around 8 or so officers to attend. Is that right?
Yeah, just whoever was on shift that day.
Yeah.
I can't remember the exact number, but it'd be around about that because
That sort of
other people
number.
weren't committed.
And would you expect them to come in a number of vehicles?
Yes, I would expect them to turn up in their units that they're allocated in. So, yeah, 2 officers per vehicle.
And when he added, bearing in mind officer safety, what did you understand that to mean?
It's basically another version of the stay safe message that they were covered further on. But I basically attend there, but bear in mind your own safety. Assess before you go in, basically.
Now, we heard earlier in the inquiry that the decision to deploy an armed response vehicle would be made by the inspector in the control room. Is that your understanding?
Yes, he's got he needs to authorise it for it to happen.
And we also heard that in an event that he made that decision, the inspector would take charge of the entire incident and would tell the officers on the ground what to do.
Yes.
Does that accord with your understanding?
Yes. It would at that point be declared a firearms incident.
Yes.
Um,
Could we then look again at the spreadsheet and at page 3? And we can see that at 7:20:13, excuse me, Inspector Stewart at the control room introduced himself and he issued an order. He said, Inspector Stewart, area control room, to the set attending. I'm monitoring this, obviously, from an ARV perspective. If you get sightings of the male, you need to make an initial assessment yourself and feedback through straight away, and I'll listen out on the channel. And we heard that order being given when we listened to the tape yesterday.
yes.
Now, I think your evidence yesterday was that you didn't hear that instruction. Is
Yes.
that right?
Yes.
That's correct.
I wasn't aware of that being passed.
If you had heard that instruction, what would you have done?
I think we kind of answered that yesterday. It hadn't been declared an ARV incident at that point. When we turned up, he wasn't actively in possession of the knife, brandishing it, and therefore we would just dealt with the situation that we had.
But if you had heard the instruction from Inspector Stewart, what would you have done?
Probably exactly the same as we've done.
So would you have ignored the instruction from Inspector Stewart?
My understanding of that would be is monitoring it for an update if we are looking to have the ARV to come into the area.
Thank you. Now, with the exception of the Dean of Faculty, who I'll come to in a moment, do any other co-participant legal representatives wish to make an application under Rule 9? Now, I'll just get my list here. So I see Ms. Mitchell. Anyone else? Sorry. Oh, Mr. Scullion. So, Ms. Mitchell, Mr. Scullion. Anyone else? No. And Dean of Faculty, do you intend to make an application under Rule 9 too?
My Lord, not as presently advised, but perhaps I could reflect on that after I've heard from Ms. Mitchell and Mr. Scullion, if your Lordship's permitted.
Yes, very well, we'll do that. Constable Walker, I wonder if you would withdraw then from the hearing room for a little, and I'll hear from Ms Mitchell and Mr Scullion. Now, you need to come to the table, yes. Now, Ms Mitchell.
Sir, I'm obliged to Senior Counsel to the Inquiry, who's also already gone over a number of questions that were put in our Rule 9, but there are some additional matters. First, a matter of clarification on the issue of PC Payton and Walker working together. He was asked about how often they'd worked together, and he said that he couldn't remember. I would say at the time we were pretty set. That was me and Alan were the van crew. As to how long that had been, I honestly can't remember. It's just wanting to clarify what he means by we're pretty set, and to see if we can get him to be a little more specific. For example, how long had they worked at Kirkcaldy together, whether it had been all the time that they had been at Kirkcaldy, etc. So it's just trying to narrow down his contact with Mr Payton as a colleague that he worked with. Perhaps he might be able to, for example, help us with weeks, months or years.
Is that the only matter?
No, there are further matters. Shall I simply continue?
Yes, carry on.
Issue 2 is the issue about PC Walker describing Sheikha Bio walking towards him after he was sprayed in the face with gas by Alan Payton. In the inquiry, he has given evidence that he walked towards him, he kept walking straight towards me, and said that Walker was trying to create space, so he's coming back round to the front of the van to create space, and he has followed me round to the front of the van. And then at which point I have sprayed my pava into his eyes. I would wish to put to him his previous statements, the two of which taken in 2015, do not suggest in any sense that Sheikha Bio followed him anywhere at all. In fact, one of the statements reflects that when he turned round after shouting him, he immediately sprayed him. And the first time that we have any indication that he said he'd walked towards him is the statement taken by the inquiry on the 7th April 2022. And then further today, or yesterday in fact, we heard more evidence that not simply was it walking towards him, but walking round the van, and that's when he then sprayed. So it seems that that is a difference, and given the fact that the witness has already said, I think on 3 occasions now, that he'd previously, that he would rather go with his original statements than his later memory, I would respectfully submit that we should test that and see whether or not his memory has now come to be wrong and his original memory is better. In relation, shall I simply continue?
Yes,
sir?
I think if you just
yeah, thank you. In relation to
tell
issue
me
3,
everything.
I would like to ask something in addition to simply asking how he physically felt when he was sprayed with the CS or PAVA, or when he felt it coming into his eyes, but also to ask him emotionally how he felt at that time. Issue 4, again, today we heard an evidence that instinct made him jump over something when he was charging towards him. Now, he's not mentioned that in any of the previous statements he's given, and I think it would be helpful if the inquiry had an opportunity to understand why he has said that only in this particular hearing, but in none of his previous statements. The next issue was that he said when he was talking about how Sheikha Bio was lying, he said, this is what we had the discussion about before when I was doing this. He might have been face down, but not in his front. I would just like to find out when he's talking about that, who's he saying that he's discussing these matters with? I wasn't clear on what discussions had taken place. The sixth issue is to ask him about a matter which occurred when it was clear Mr. Bayo was in some way unwell, as he records in his statement that PC Payton, still kneeling beside the man's face, slapped him a couple of times on the face to see if there was any reaction. And I wanted to ask him about that, in particular, whether or not he considers that a recognised way of ascertaining if this a reaction to a man who appears to be at best perhaps unconscious. The next issue that I would like to ask about is the issue of race, and it arises somewhat from what my learned friend has already said. This officer has indicated that he's not come across any examples of racial discrimination or heard racist jokes or comments, and I would like to put to him for his consideration that at least one of his colleagues had described Mr. Bayo in their statement as coloured, to ask him whether or not he would consider that was a matter which he would find unacceptable and would have to take up with his colleague had he heard it. And that's in one of the police officer's statements. The last and discrete point that I would like to raise in relation to racist stereotyping. The witness says, "I am not aware of any stereotyping," and I have gathered together a list of the descriptions that were used by Mr. Sheku Bayo by a number of the police officers, and I wish to ask him individually if he considers whether or not those were stereotyping. They include, and touch upon, my learned friend did go to this, but a fuller list which elicits a better, a list, I suppose, of what might be described as racist stereotyping, including his size, how well built he was, a frightening, crazy man, an intimidating figure who they were scared of, deranged with superhuman strength, those sorts of things. So I would like to put it to the witness whether or not he considered any of those as stereotyping, to ascertain whether in fact he properly understands what the issue of stereotyping is. Those would be the issues I would like to raise.
Mr. Scullion, what did you want to deal with?
A Rule 9 application was lodged in relation to this witness, and Senior Counsel to the Inquiry has asked questions in relation to that application. But in relation to a specific matter, the witness gave evidence that during the period following the incident, he was waiting on officers from PIRC to come and take a statement. And in that regard, he was asked about a meeting which took place on 7th May of 2015, and he confirmed that he had met with officers on that date, and that he was asked to provide a statement on that date, but that he gave evidence that he was under the impression at that time that the officers were not from PIRC. He said that he thought the officers were MIT who were operating, he thought, a parallel investigation to PIRC. He also said that he was informed not to give a statement as it was a tick box exercise, and so he needn't provide a statement. The officers that PC Walker met with were Detective Chief Inspector Keith Hardy and the Detective Inspector Stuart Wilson. Those officers were at that time acting on behalf of PIRC and were there on the instruction of PIRC in order to obtain a statement. Now, on 4th June of 2015, PC Walker gave a statement to PIRC, which is reference PIRC 00264, and in that statement in June of 2015, he told the officers at that time that when he was asked to provide a statement on 7th May of 2015, he had refused to provide the statement on the basis of legal advice. Now, in my submission, that is different from thinking that it was a tick box exercise that there was really no point in. There will be, I anticipate, evidence in this case that he was informed at the meeting on 7th May of 2015 that he was being asked to provide a statement in relation to the incident, and during that meeting he was informed that his status was that of witness, but he refused to provide a statement on the basis of legal advice, and I would wish to clarify with the witness whether he refused to provide the statement on the basis of legal advice at that time in the knowledge of his status, rather than because he thought it was an inconsequential tick-box exercise.
Thank you. Excuse me. I shall allow both of you, to each of you rather, to ask these questions. I would have thought between you, you would complete him this afternoon without any difficulty, would you?
I would hope so, my
I would
lord.
hope so.
I certainly won't be long.
Yes, I can see that. Very well. I think I may have to rise very, very briefly in order to set up the table for the examiner and the witness. So we'll do that. Ms Mitchell.
Thank you. I wonder if I can ask you, first of all, yesterday you explained that you and PC Peyton had worked together, and you were asked a specific question about how long you'd worked together.
Mm-hmm.
And you said, I honestly can't remember as to when we moved teams about, people get moved within teams. I would say at that time we were pretty set. It was me and Alan were the van crew for that shift. As to how long that had been for, I honestly can't remember. Now, I wonder if we can try and narrow that down a little. Do you know how long both yourself and PC Peyton worked together at Kirkcaldy?
No, that's the bit as I'm saying. I moved teams within Kirkcaldy as well, and Alan will have moved teams within Kirkcaldy.
So you don't know how long he has worked at Kirkcaldy for?
How long Alan's worked at Kirkcaldy for?
Yes.
I wouldn't be able to say. I think because he moved moved departments as well. So he was in community for a bit, and he was in the response for a bit. So some days I'd see him for a while, some days I wouldn't. So
Okay.
that's.
Would you know that if he'd gone somewhere else to work somewhere else, to a different police station?
No particularly.
You said at that time we were pretty set. What did you mean by that?
That the pairings were pretty set. So when we came in for a muster and a day shift, it would be a safe assumption that me and Alan would be on the van, and the pairings were set. You got used to who you were working with.
And how long had that been in place for?
That's what I'm saying. I can't remember.
Well, could you help us with this? Was it years? Was it months? Was it weeks?
I honestly don't know. I honestly don't know how long I was on that team at that time.
So, if you weren't on that team, even though you were both within Kirkcaldy, you could be simply not see one another from week to week, month to month, year to year.
Yeah, pretty much. If I'm team 4 and he's the opposite team, when he goes days off, I start day shift. When I go night shift, he starts day shift, and you never see each other.
Were there other times that you worked together?
I think that's the first time. I honestly couldn't tell you.
So when you say we were pretty set, you have in your mind at that time that it was you and Alan that worked together?
Yes.
PCP.
Yeah.
But you can't remember?
For how long that had been the case, no.
Is it likely to have been years?
I can't, honestly, I can't recall who moved off the team, who was there, when he came, when he didn't. I mean, it's 10 years, or 17 years now, we moving and shifting, so.
Moving then on to another issue I want to speak to you about. You've given evidence to the inquiry that the sequence of events was that you see PC Peyton spray Mr. Bio, that you shout and attract his attention,
Yes.
that he turns and starts to walk towards you, you back away from him, he continues to come towards you and you're backing away round the van.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Around the front of the van is my recollection. Yes.
Around the front of the van. And at that point, as you're walking around the front of the van, you then spray him. Is that a fair summary of what your evidence has been?
Yes, because he's closing down the gap quicker than I could back away from him.
Now, and I think your words were, because I was trying to create the space, so I was coming back round the front of the van to try and to create the space, and he has followed me round the front of the van.
Yeah.
And then you've said, and then at which point I have sprayed my pava into his eyes and made quite good contact with it.
Yes.
Okay. Now, I wonder if I might take you to your previous statements. The first statement is a statement you took by yourself, and that's Perk 265. I wonder if Miss... Thank you. And I'd like you to go to page 3 of 7, please. Now, if I can take you to about halfway down that second paragraph, you can see there's a paragraph that starts, I drove the vehicle in the direction of the male. Do you see that?
Yes.
And if we can go slightly further down, we see that PC Peyton exits the vehicle. And PC Peyton gives a command and PC Peyton thereafter deployed the CS spray at the male. Do you see you've written that there?
Can you do what the PC Peyton who takes this backward? Which is a clear verbal command. And thereafter deployed CS spray at the male. Yep.
Yeah. Now, can I ask you, from that deployed the CS spray at the male, can I ask you to read the last 3 lines and the next paragraph? The next paragraph to the part where it says PAVA to the male's face and eyes. I'll just stop you when you get to that point.
So I noted that the CS spray appeared to have no effect on the male. I am aware that the PAVA spray that I have been issued is superior to CS spray and that should have an effect on all persons. By this time I had exited the vehicle. I walked around the front of the van to the male's 8 o'clock position. I gave a clear verbal warning to the male to stop and to drop any weapons. I noted at this time that PC Peyton had suffered from the effects of spray and was struggling to see him as disorientated.
Sorry, can I ask you just to keep your voice up a little?
Yep. The male, now aware of my presence, turned his head in my direction, and appearing not to following any of the directions given, I therefore deployed PAVA spray. It was approximately 8 feet from the male and administered the direct spray of PAVA to the male's face and eyes.
Right, if I can ask you to stop there. Do we see that there you don't mention that the male was walking towards you?
Yep.
And do we see that there is no mention of him following you round as you back away round the van?
Yep.
And in fact, if we go on to the next paragraph, if you can read out that next paragraph.
From I felt several drops of PAVA.
Indeed.
I felt several drops of PAVA spray then hit me in the eyes, and due to the windy conditions at Locust, this immediately had an effect on me, caused my eyes to start nipping. I started blinking rapidly and raised my hands to my face to overcome the effect while stepping back to the offside of the police vehicle, placing the vehicle between myself and the male. At this time I transmitted on the police radio, spray ineffective.
So can we see there that the statement that you took yourself, this was your aide memoir at the time, has the circumstances differently, that you sprayed Sheikh Obayo first with the spray, it doesn't mention that he was walking towards you, and then said that you went round the van after you had sprayed him in order to create distance because you're getting the spray in your eyes. Do you see that?
I disagree with the second part. That goes with the statement that I said that I ended up on the off side of the van to crouch and get away from him. I didn't went round the other side of the van to put the van between us. That's a different statement.
I think what you've read here is, I started blinking rapidly and raised my hands to my face to overcome the effect while stepping back to the offside of the police vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
So the spray went into your eyes and you moved to the back of the vehicle.
Yes, which is what I stated earlier. The spray was in my eyes, I ducked away and ended up at the back of the offside of the vehicle.
I wonder if I can take you to the next statement. That would be PERC 264, Ms Drury. And can we go to the bottom of page 5 of 14? And at the bottom of page 5, do you see a paragraph that said, it was clear to me that PC Peyton got some of the spray in his face?
Yes.
So it says, it was clear to me that PC Peyton got some of the spray in his face and he immediately tried to duck away and crouch downwards towards the van. He pulled both his hands up towards his face. From my experience, I reckoned he'd be in a bit of pain from CS and would be unable to see properly or defend himself properly. So he would be pretty much out of the game. No other officers had arrived at that stage as far as I was aware. As I got past the front of the van, He turned towards me after I shouted at him, "Stay there," or words to that effect. Do you see that?
Yes.
Then says, he faced me, and I had my pava spray in the drawn position I described in my right hand. I also had my left arm extended, pointing at him. I think I was standing in a defensive position. I again shouted, "Drop your weapon," or something like that, but there was no response from him. I still thought he had a weapon concealed in him, and he wasn't giving verbal or non-verbal communications at all. And then you write, I immediately discharged my pava spray at him. I didn't issue a warning, the discharge, but it would be obvious to him as I had it up in front of him in plain sight and had a bright red lid on it. So do we see once again that in this statement, which was taken, I think, in June of 2015, 4th June 2015, you don't make any mention there that he was walking towards you?
No, I make mention to the fact that he's closed the distance to about 8 feet in the next line.
He's closed the distance to about 8 feet, but you've already identified, in fact, that you'd sprayed him by that point.
No, that was the point I sprayed him. The canister sprayed directly into his face from a distance of 8 feet, so at the point of spraying, he was 8 feet away.
Okay. You haven't said at all that he turned and walked towards you?
Yeah, I appreciate that line's not there, but it is covered by the statement that he's managed to get to within 8 feet of me at that point.
Or that he followed you in front of the van?
That doesn't give my position anywhere in that statement, really.
So, in the first two statements in 2015, you have indicated in the first statement that he turned towards you and you deployed the spray, and in the second one that he turned towards you and deployed the spray, but you have not mentioned in either of those that he started walking towards you or came round towards you at the front of the van. Is that correct?
No, I would argue in the second one I certainly said that he's got to within 8 feet of me, so he's had to come from not being 8 feet to me to 8 feet to me, and I've not moved.
And your explanation for why you've not put that in your first statement?
That was just that was prepared a couple of days after the event, and I've probably just an omission at that point. And when I was going into further detail with the park investigators, I've covered it in greater detail.
It seems when you have looked at your first statement, you've been very, very clear about the time that you've deployed the pava spray. Would you agree with that? The statement, Perk 265.
265.
And we're looking at page 3 of 7, the bottom of page 3 of 7. And if we look at the second last paragraph, do you see what it says in that paragraph is you issue a command to stop and drop any weapons?
Mm-hmm.
Do you then see that you see PC Peyton is struggling to see and was disoriented?
And again, in that statement, it says that the pava was deployed when he was 8 feet from me as well.
And you've said the male, now aware of my presence, turned his head in my direction. So you've gone into the detail of how he came to be looking at you. He turned his head in my direction, whilst appearing not to be following any of the directions given. And your next statement is, I therefore deployed the pava spray. You haven't said before he was further away than 8 feet. You've said he turned his head in your direction and therefore you deployed the pava spray. Is that correct?
That's the wording of that statement, yes.
And if we go to the final paragraph of that statement, the final paragraph on that page, which is page 3 of 7. It says, I felt several drops of Pava spray then hit me in the eyes due to the windy conditions at the locus. This immediately had an effect on me and caused my eyes to start nipping. I started blinking rapidly and raised my hands to my face to overcome the effect, whilst stepping back to the offside of the police vehicle. So do we see that contemporaneously with feeling the effects of the Pava spray that you have sprayed on him, it is you who go back during that period of time, because at that time you're feeling the effects of the spray.
No, I disagree with that interpretation of that paragraph. That I've had the after effects of the spray, and I've made my way to the offside of the vehicle. That doesn't suggest that I walked around the front to the offside of the vehicle.
Well, I wonder if we can just try and analyse that. The first thing is that you feel drops of spray, and that's after you've said that you did this because he turned his head in your direction and you sprayed him. It doesn't say you were walking towards him. Sorry, it doesn't say he was walking towards you. It doesn't say you were backing away from him to create space while he was walking towards you.
It doesn't say I was walking towards him.
No, but it doesn't say that you were walking backwards as he was walking towards you. It doesn't say that you were moving round the back of round the front of the van to create space. The only time that it mentions you walking round to the front of the van was already when you had Pava drops sprayed in your eyes, and this having an immediate effect on you meant that you started blinking rapidly, raised your hands to your face to overcome the effects whilst stepping back to the offside of the police vehicle. Are you suggesting that that doesn't mean that what happened was he turned his head, you sprayed him, it came back and affected you, and then you went round to the van, you went round the van?
No, it says I stepped back to the offside of the police vehicle. So if I'm at the front of the vehicle and I step back, I end up on the offside of the vehicle. It doesn't say anywhere about me moving round from the front of the vehicle to the offside or passing the front of the vehicle to get to the offside. There's no mention of the front of the vehicle in that paragraph at all.
Sorry, back to the offside of the police vehicle.
Yes. So if I'm standing in front of the vehicle, having walked past the front of the vehicle, when I'm off the offside front light cluster, if I take a step back, I'm on the offside of the vehicle.
And nowhere in either of those statements does it suggest that you were doing that because Sheikh Abayo was walking towards you.
Well, like I said, it's covered it with the... I mean, I appreciate that it's not stated, but there is parts in there which suggest that he's got to within 8 feet of me.
Wouldn't it have simply been easy to do so, if he was walking towards you, to put that in? It seems like an odd thing to leave out.
The statement was prepared by myself at the house a couple of days after the event, and I was just trying to recall things to the best of my recollection at that time. And I say further things have been cleared when it was given it to the Perk investigators.
You've already been taken back to previous statements, I think on 3 occasions, and you've accepted that your memory would have been better for those occasions at the time. Why not this particular issue? Why are you so clear that he was walking towards you when that's not been recorded as your evidence or in your statements in 2015?
Because the times where I've said, if it was when I was referring left to right or something like that, it was basically stated to be different. There's nothing I could see in this statement that's contradictory to what I've suggested.
Would it not be... Sorry.
No, I mean, fair enough, I will admit that it's not as clear detail, but there's nothing in there that contradicts to what I've said.
Would it not be important to note in a statement if someone was walking towards you before you discharged your spray?
But again, he's got to the point where he's been 8 feet from me. So
Well, the question was, would it not be important to note at the point you're discharging your spray that someone was walking towards you?
the statement could be clearer in that fact, but I don't think it makes the statement any less true.
Does it not suggest that what happened was contained in the first two statements that you've given in 2015? That in fact he wasn't walking towards you?
No, I would say that he was walking towards me and he was approximately 8 feet from me when I administered the spray of Pava.
I wonder if I can move on to the next issue. You have explained to us how you felt physically when you got Pava in your eyes, but how did you feel emotionally when that happened?
In what way?
How did you feel?
Like I said, it was the instinctive reaction to duck away, and I'm not sure.
Well, why? What did you feel emotionally? You must have had an emotional reaction to the circumstances that you were in.
No, it was a physical reaction, the pain in the eyes.
You didn't have any emotional feeling at the time that it happened. Well, why did you duck away?
Like I said, that's a biological reaction to the pain in the eyes. You move away from the pain source.
Well,
is my understanding of how the Pava works.
I suppose the pain source would be in your eyes, so you wouldn't be moving away.
Well, no, but your body tries to move away from the pain source.
So are you simply saying you had no emotional reaction, or you can't recall an emotional reaction?
I don't recall a notable emotional reaction at that point.
We've heard in evidence that you've suggested that you had an instinct to jump over something when you charged at Sheikh-Ubayo.
Mm-hmm.
That piece of information hasn't been contained in any of your previous statements, as far as I'm aware. So none in the one that you wrote by yourself in 2015, shortly after the incident, not the one in June of 2015, not the one given to Perk, and not the one given to the inquiry. This appears new evidence. Can you explain why you haven't mentioned that before in any of your statements?
No, but it's something that I do distinctly remember.
Again, wouldn't it be important if there was something you distinctly remembered like that to put it in any of these previous statements when you're being asked about what happened? We can, if you want, we can go through the other statements. I don't think anyone is seeking to correct me that it's not contained in those other statements.
It's I need to take your word that it's not in the first two statements. I need to check through them all.
Well, I'm sure if they are, someone will explain that to us and lead that evidence before the inquiry. But It appears that that is the only time you've ever mentioned that. My question is to you, if that was something that had happened, can you explain why you didn't put it in any of your previous statements?
No.
You would realise that these statements are obviously clearly very important,
Yes.
and that the detail of these statements is going to be important and gone through by others in some detail.
Yes.
But you simply can't help the inquiry with why you didn't put that in.
I don't. I mean, in relation to the inquiry statement, I don't think it was a particular question that was asked in the ruling request. But
Well, you perhaps wouldn't be asked something in relation to something that you'd never mentioned before. You wouldn't be asked a question.
well, in that case, I can't be criticised for not answering the question that was never asked.
Well, what you no doubt have been asked quite clearly on a number of occasions is to explain what has happened. And I'm suggesting you simply haven't indicated on previous occasions that somehow instinct made you jump over something.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if you have any explanation for why that's been missed out.
Made, isn't it?
I'm obliged, my lord.
Let's move on now.
I'm obliged. We move on to another issue. You said in evidence earlier today you were being asked about Mr. Bio in the prone position, and you said, you mean by on his front? This is what we had a discussion about before when I was doing this. He might have been face down, but not on his front. So you went across from over to here, and you were indicating. What I want to know is, when you said, this is what we had the discussion about before when I was doing this, what did you mean? What discussion? You were talking about the physical, Mr. Bio being physically restrained. You were talking about him lying down, and it was just a sentence. I've sort of cut and pasted it from the transcript. So the exact words were, you mean by on his front, this is what we had the discussion about before when I was doing this.
I was filling out the reply to the ruling request.
And who did you have the discussion with?
The person that was noting my statement.
I see. I want to take you on to an issue in relation to your PERC statement, PERC statement 264, page 8 of 14. Thank you. And this is at a point, PC Walker, when Mr. Bio was already restrained on the ground, and it was clear that there was some kind of issue with his physical health. And you have recorded at the bottom of this paragraph, PC Smith knelt down beside the man at his left-hand side. He leaned down with his ear to his face, looking down onto his chest. PC Smith said, he's still breathing. And you have recorded that you recall PC Payton then, still kneeling beside the man's face, slapped him a couple of times to see if there was any reaction. He didn't move. Is that a recognised way to ascertain if there's a reaction to someone who you've come across who's perhaps unconscious?
A pain reaction, just to see if there's any sort of. I want to say that I don't know if it'd be recognised or what. I mean, I can't answer on behalf of PC Payton.
Well, I'm asking whether or not if that would be something that you would do to test for a reaction. Is that, for example, something that you're trained to do?
I mean, part of the OST training is to see if there's a pain reaction in somebody, to see if they could, and then
And as part of that training, do they suggest slapping a person?
I think it was done with the best intentions to see if the male was conscious.
Are you able to answer the question? Is that part of the training? Any training you get?
I mean, the training is to see if there's a reaction from somebody.
Yes.
Yeah, and that could be rouse them, shake them. I mean, the rules, I'm saying the rules, the guidance changed, but it used to like sort of nip people's ears and that to see if you could get a reaction from them, or push down on the top of their eyelid or something like that, so to try and get a pain reaction from someone.
So you've explained the pinching the earlobe, pressing down the eyes. Was slapping one of them?
Anything to sort of test to see if there was a pain reaction. But again, I don't know. I don't know if it was an official test, but like I said, it was done with the intention of seeing if there was a reaction to see if the male was unconscious.
If I may move on to the next issue, that in relation to race. Now, you've said in your time at Kirkcaldy Police Office, which has been how long?
At that time, it was 10 years.
10 years. At your time at Kirkcaldy Police Office, you've never seen any examples of racial discrimination.
Correct.
You've not come across any racist jokes or comments.
Not that I could recall.
And if you did come across anything like that, you would respond by challenging them.
Yes.
At that particular time, we may hear evidence that one of your colleagues used the word coloured to describe Mr. Sheikubayo. If you heard that, what would you have done?
Corrected them into the use of the word that he was a black man, and that there is some sensitivities around the use of the word coloured.
When you say some sensitivities, it's not an acceptable term.
Yeah.
So you would have challenged them.
Yes.
You indicated that you are not aware of any racist stereotyping that you have yourself been involved in. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And you were given one or two examples of that by my learned friend who spoke to you about that. I wonder if I can run through a list just now to see whether or not you consider any of these might be racist stereotyping. Being described as a large black male. Would you describe that as a possibly racist stereotype?
Not if it's an accurate description.
Could be part of a terrorist plot?
There needs to be more information surrounding that before you could draw a conclusion.
Describing someone on your way to this incident, I kept thinking about the Lee Rigby boy, the soldier who was killed. Would you consider there'd been any racist stereotyping going on there?
In relation to?
In relation to the use of that comment, in relation to someone thinking that when they were hearing they were going out to a call where a black man had a knife, that they kept thinking about Lee Rigby, the soldier who was killed?
Now, that would depend on the nature of the call.
Well, we will no doubt hear, and we have already heard evidence in this case about the nature of the call and the nature of the call that you received. And what I'm asking you to do is consider whether or not you think any of these might be racist stereotypes.
So you're speaking specifically in relation to this call?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think someone thinking, I kept thinking about Lee Rigby boy, the soldier who was killed?
That would depend on their perception of it.
What about the phrase, I cannot emphasise the strength of this guy?
Again, if it's an accurate description.
You say an accurate description, one person suggesting he was massive and is the biggest male I have ever seen. That wouldn't be an accurate description of Mr. Bio, would it?
Not for me to describe him as that.
Well, not for anyone who
Yeah.
would be working with you, for
Yeah.
example. So it wouldn't be a correct description to be applying to Mr. Bio.
Again, it would depend on their perception at the time, but
And if their perception at the time was he was massive and is the biggest male that I have seen, do you think that could be racial stereotyping?
again, I mean, it could be referring to his muscular build, or I don't know. You're asking me to answer questions on behalf of on their perception of something.
I'm asking you whether or not you consider that could be racial stereotyping. I'm not asking you what they were thinking. I'm asking whether you consider that that could be racial stereotyping. He was massive and is the biggest male I have seen.
Now, if somebody was to say that to me about someone, then I would just need to say that, that was their judgment and their description of the male.
I've never seen a more frightening, crazy man in my life, and I could see he was completely out of control. Could that be an example of racial stereotyping?
No, if it's factual to that person.
He was an intimidating figure. I was scared of them. I was scared of him, sorry.
Mm-hmm. Again, if that's factual to that person, if that's how they're feeling, and that's theirs.
The man was deranged with superhuman strength and, in my mind, intent on killing someone. Might that be racial stereotyping?
Again, that could just be somebody's perception of the incident.
Could you allow me one moment, sir? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mitchell. Mr. Scullion.
Thank you. There's only one small chapter of your evidence I want to ask you about. You gave evidence earlier that you were off sick for a period immediately following the incident.
Yes.
And you knew there had been a death in custody and that the PIRC would be investigating.
Yes.
And earlier you said that when you were off sick, you were waiting for the PIRC to take a statement from you.
Waiting for somebody to come in contact with me to arrange for a statement to be taken from me, yeah.
And you met with police officers on, I think you said 7th or 8th May of 2015, but we'll hear it was the 7th of May. And the officers that you met with were Detective Chief Inspector Keith Hardy and a Detective Inspector Stuart Wilson. Do you remember that meeting?
I don't remember the names of the gentlemen, but yeah, if they were the gentlemen from the MIT team, then yes, I remember that meeting. And
at that meeting, were you asked to provide a statement?
We were asked that we were told that they were from the MIT team and that we were prepared to provide a statement at that point.
Did you meet individually with the officers?
Yes.
And at that meeting, did the two officers ask you to provide a statement?
Yes.
And I think earlier you said, and I think you may have repeated it a moment ago, that that you were under the impression that it was not the PIRC who was asking you to provide a statement. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, the inquiry may hear evidence that Detective Chief Inspector Hardy and Detective Inspector Wilson were there to note a statement on behalf of the PIRC, but as I understand it, your evidence is that you didn't know that. Is that correct?
That's correct. That was never passed on or disclosed.
And earlier you said you thought that MIT were operating a parallel investigation to the PIRC. Is that right?
Yes. Well, that's the only reason I could assume as to why they would want a statement.
And you thought or were told on that day that this statement was a tick box exercise. Is that how you described it?
That's how it was described to me.
Right, and that therefore you needn't provide a statement.
Yes, it was a, we'll ask you for it and then just tell them that on the advice that you've gotten, you don't need to provide one.
All right. Do you remember you gave a statement to the PIRC on 4th June of 2015?
Was that at the police college?
Yes.
Yes.
And that's statement reference PIRC 00264. I wonder if you could look at a passage in that statement. It's at the penultimate page of the document. Just to the top of that page. Now, do you see the passage which begins, that was either on Thursday 7th, do you see that? That was either
yes.
on Thursday 7 or Friday 8 May, when I was asked in Kirkcaldy Police Station just after incident counselling. I was asked to go and see DI Stuart Wilson in the Chief Inspector's room. He was with a DCI who I don't know and have never met before. I think they were both from the major investigation team. You see that? Does it continue? DI Wilson asked if I would be prepared to provide a statement at that time. I told him that based on legal advice I had been given, I would be declining to do so. Do you see that?
Yes.
So looking back now, did you decline to provide a statement on 7th May 2015 because you thought it was a tick box exercise that you didn't need to provide a statement, or did you decline to provide a statement on the basis of legal advice?
No, that was declined because it was a tick box exercise and I was told to say that on the basis of legal advice we were told not to provide one.
So when you were told that it was a tick box exercise, part of that was it was a tick box exercise, so refused to provide a statement on the basis of legal advice?
Yeah, to give that as a reason as to why you weren't providing a statement.
And had you been given legal advice at that stage?
I don't think so. When was that? 7th? No, I don't think we had it at that time. The days round about the aftermath of that was, I lost track of them all.
Sure.
So the dates didn't mean too much to me. I was going in and out of the police station for certain things.
At the meeting on 7th May, do you remember a discussion taking place about your status at that time?
No.
But you'll be aware that by status I mean whether you were a witness or a suspect
yes.
at that time. At the meeting on 7th May 2015, do you recall being informed by either Detective Chief Inspector Hardy or Detective Inspector Wilson that your status was that of witness?
No. That they were just going to take a statement from us.
So you don't recall being informed that your status was a witness and thereafter declining to provide a statement on the basis of legal advice that you had been given?
Yeah, we never got as far as I'm sort of saying if the statement would be under caution or anything like that. It was just you got to provide a statement.
I'm not suggesting that you would have been informed that the statement was under caution. What I'm suggesting is that you were informed that you were a witness, not a suspect, and that you were asked to provide a statement in those circumstances. You don't remember that?
No, I don't think we were given any. That's your status at that point, no.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Scullion. Dean of Faculty, what's your position now?
My Lord, I wonder, I'm sorry, I'll sit down.
Yes, I think probably.
The only matter I would wish an opportunity to clarify, sorry, my microphone's down, would relate to Ms Mitchell's issue 2. It will take me 5 minutes. Rather than the court adjourning, if your Lordship's happy, I'll just simply swap positions with Mr Scullion.
Yes, that's fine.
Obliged. I'm sorry, would your lordship give me 1 second?
I thought you might need
Can you make sure that your microphone is not picking up this conversation, please?
My Lord, just before I go to the point that I was going to clarify, I'll friend suggest it might be helpful, just in light of the question asked by Ms Mitchell about the Lee Rigby affair, if the witness could be directed to document PS 09749.
Documents are going to be used on a day or in a bundle. So, would it be easier if Miss Graham dealt with this?
Well, I mean, it's perhaps, I think it's the inquiry have it. It may be acceptable to someone. Do you recall anything about a stay safe message from Assistant Chief Constable Rory Nicholson, the 19th of February 2015?
The memos that came out on the internet, the video, is that the one you're referring to?
Yes.
Yes.
What was said to members of Police Scotland is, this means an attack is highly likely, although it is uncertain what form it may take. We have witnessed recent attacks in Copenhagen, Paris, Australia and Canada, and we can clearly recall the murder of Fusilier Lee Rigby on the streets of Woolwich. Was that something that Police Scotland were keen to make officers aware of?
Yes.
In 2015?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. PC Walker, the other thing I wanted to ask you about is you recall the suggestion that there was an inconsistency in the original PERC statement. Can we have that back, please? PERC 00265. And we go to the third page. And down to the bottom, please, penultimate paragraph, so up a bit, thank you. If we just look at what you've written here, PC Walker, but this time I had exited the vehicle and had walked round the front of the van to the male's 8 o'clock position. I gave a clear verbal warning to the male to stop and to drop any weapons. I noted this time PC Payton had suffered from the effects of CS spray, struggling to see and was disorientated. The male, now aware of my presence, turned his head in my direction, whilst appearing not to be following any of the directions given. Now, earlier in that paragraph, you've mentioned 2 directions. One, drop any weapons. Do we understand from what you've said already, he didn't drop any weapons?
Yes.
The other direction that you record having given was for him to stop. Does this mean that he didn't follow that direction either?
Yes.
And if he didn't stop, what was he doing?
Walking towards me and closing the gap down to being approximately 8 feet away, as per my statement.
Yeah. So is there any inconsistency in this statement with what you've told the inquiry?
No. Like I stated earlier, there was maybe not sufficient detail, but there's nothing in it to contradict what I'd said.
Would you have sprayed him if he'd just been standing there doing nothing?
No.
Why did you spray him?
Because he was closing the distance to me and was an immediate threat to my safety. And I had to use defensive tactics at that point.
The other physical interaction before the restraint that you had with Mr. Bio was the shoulder charge. Why did you do that?
In order to get him, or to bring him under arrest and to remove him away from Constable Tomlinson and Constable Short.
Is this after he'd chased Constable Short?
Yes.
Had PC Short done anything to warrant being chased by Mr. Bio?
Not that I was aware of.
Had she done anything to warrant being struck and knocked to the ground by Mr. Bio?
Not that I was aware of.
Had she done anything to warrant being stamped on by Mr. Bio?
Not that I was aware of.
And were your actions in response to that?
Yes.
Thank you, PC Walker. I'm obliged, my lord.
Thank you. Constable Walker, thank you for coming and giving evidence to the inquiry. You're now free to go.
Thank you.
Well, we'll adjourn now and we'll sit again on Tuesday. We're going to have a slightly earlier start on Tuesday at 9:30. Very well.